Hoy en la entrevista recibimos a un abogado británico, profesor de derecho en el University College de Londres, que ha alcanzado fama mundial como escritor, autor de varios libros enfocados en crímenes contra la humanidad. Su más reciente obra se llama Calle Londres 38 y habla del proceso judicial contra Augusto Pinochet en Londres y de la presencia del oficial nazi Walther Rauff en Chile y de la relación entre ambas historias. En la entrevista recibimos a Phillipe Sands. En el día de hoy en la entrevista tenemos un capítulo muy especial. Vamos a hablar con un autor que está dando muchísimo que hablar en el mundo y también en Chile con este libro, Calle Londres 38. 2 casos de impunidad, Pinochet en Inglaterra y un nazi en la Patagonia. Una historia que conecta la historia del nazi Walther Rauff, quien vivió en nuestro país hasta su muerte luego de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, con la historia de Augusto Pinochet y su detención en Londres en 1998. Cómo se conectan esas dos historias, cómo una investigación llega también a establecer esas relaciones y a juntar en un libro a Walther Rauff y Augusto Pinochet, es lo que vamos a conversar precisamente con el autor de esta historia, quien está en Chile promocionando este libro, Phillipe Sands. Phillipe, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Buenos días, it's great to be with you.
Phillipe, ¿cómo te interesaste en la historia de Walther Rauff?
I'd been involved in 1998 in the case of Pinochet in London, and then about 15 years later I was doing research on another book called Ruta de Escape, and I came across a letter written by Walther Rauff to a comrade, Otto Wächter, who was the subject of the other book, written from Damascus, telling Wächter, don't come to the Arab world, go to South America. Who is this Rauff? I did a bit of Google searching and I discovered that he was the man who operated the gas vans in Central Europe, killed hundreds of thousands of people. He'd left, he'd escaped, he'd then ended up, in the end, in 1958 in Chile, in Punta Arenas, as the manager of the Pesquera Camello. And I asked myself the question, could this Walther Rauff be connected in some way to Augusto Pinochet?
Let's talk about Walther Rauff. Hablemos de Walther Rauff y su escape. Él escapó a Siria. Dijiste que escribió esa carta desde Damasco, luego pasó a Ecuador y a Chile. ¿Cómo lo hizo? ¿Cómo pudo escapar del lugar después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial? After World War II.
They were looking for him, and he went back from Syria to Italy, and then on Italy he traveled by boat from Genoa with his wife, Edith, and his 2 boys. And they went straight to Ecuador. I think he expected to spend the rest of his life in Ecuador. But in 1956, he and his wife, Edith, met a charming Chilean couple. There are many wonderful people in Chile. And the Chilean couple said, you're in the wrong country. You should come to Chile. And in fact, Rauff had been to Chile in 1925 when he was in the German Navy, to Valparaiso and to Punta Arenas. And they left. They sent their boys to the military academy, to the army academy, to the navy academy, and then they followed in 1958. As you know, in 63 there was a big drama. Finally, West German justice caught up with Rauff and tried to extradite him from Chile to West Germany. That failed. The Chilean Supreme Court ruled by 6 votes to 1 that there was a statute of limitations, prescription, and he could not be extradited. He goes back to Punta Arenas. And then, sort of miracle of miracles, on September the 11th, 1973, his friend from Quito, Ecuador, becomes the head of the military junta because it is Augusto Pinochet.
¿Cómo se conocieron en Ecuador y cómo es posible asegurar que eran cercanos, Rauff y Pinochet, cuando estaban en Ecuador, Rauff and Pinochet?
Well, Augusto Pinochet went to Ecuador as a sort of military attaché, and he did military training. He also actually enrolled at law school and hoped to get a law degree, which he failed to do. I don't know precisely how they met, but how do I know they met? Firstly, I've got some of Rauff's letters, and he describes in those letters and in some private interviews he gave to a German journalist, Gerd Heidemann, how he had come to know Augusto Pinochet. But also I have come to know the grandson of Walther Rauff, absolutely lovely man who's very open with me, Walther Rauff Jr., and he confirmed that Augusto Pinochet had been the key person, actually with Carlos Prats, in arranging for the Rauffs to move from Ecuador to Chile.
¿Pinochet sabía que él era un ex líder nazi? ¿Sabía que había tenido un papel clave en el exterminio de miles de judíos?
You know, I don't know, and I sort of think probably not in 1955. I think he would have known about his naval past. We know that Rauff did not talk very openly, for obvious reasons, about what he had done, so I'm sure he would have intimated he had a role in intelligence, he had a role in the, German government, shall we say. I doubt he would have talked about the details. And I think Pinochet would have known the generalities and would not have objected to the fact that someone who was associated with the Nazi regime could nevertheless be a decent and friendly acquaintance. But Augusto Pinochet would have learned, as the rest of Chile learned, in December 1962, when Rauff was arrested. And at that point it was front page news. It was all over the newspaper.
Yeah. Let's talk about it, because sí, hablemos de eso, porque Walther Rauff llegó a Chile y empezó a trabajar. ¿Qué estaba haciendo en Chile antes de ser arrestado en los años 60? Arrested in the 60s.
He had various jobs, none very successful. He worked in the Sarah Brown concession. He was a traveling salesman. And then in the small town of Porvenir, where I've been many times, he met another German immigrant who had set up a pesquera, the pesquera pirata, and he started working around the fishing industry. And eventually he met a family called the Camelio family, who were a distinguished family in Punta Arenas, and he was hired and he became el jefe. And I've spoken to many of the ladies who worked with him in 1963, 64, and they all knew. They all said, we all knew what he had done, but we cared about our jobs, we cared about finding a husband. It was long ago, far away, and they were at the end of the world.
Do you think that he... ¿Crees que él obtuvo ese trabajo en la Patagonia porque era un ex líder nazi? Because he was a Nazi leader?
No. I think he was a very efficient administrator. He, I think there's a sense in Chile, I don't want to put it too strongly, but Germans have a reputation for efficiency. They follow orders, they do what they're required to do, they do it well, they do it professionally, and he plainly was a very good administrator. That's no doubt. I mean, the other thing is that he had a secret life. He had also been a secret agent for the West German intelligence service, the BND, and no one I spoke to knew about that. So this is a complicated individual.
That's pretty amazing. Eso es bastante sorprendente porque él, como tú escribes en el libro, se convierte en agente del servicio secreto alemán, el Bundesnachrichtendienst. Incluso regresa luego a Alemania.
Yes, in his own name. It's unbelievable. And he returns to Germany, and the day they arrive, there's a magazine article about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, and he is named in the article. And his wife is really worried that they're going to get in trouble. He says, don't worry, I'm protected, I'm looked after. So someone in West Germany, I mean, the West German government, like many governments, was divided. You've got the Justice Department that's hunting him, and you've got the Intelligence Department that is protecting him.
And a few years, y unos años después es arrestado por orden de un tribunal alemán en Chile. ¿Qué pasó ahí? Chile. What happens there?
So he's arrested in December evening in Punta Arenas. He's living above the Grand Palace Cinema. He's escorted to the airport. He's flown up to Santiago, and he has a first hearing. One judge rules that he should be extradited. He then appeals the case, and the case then goes to the Supreme Court, which rules by 6 votes to 1 he cannot be extradited. Now, interestingly, again, as another point of detail and connection, the main lawyer who's involved in the arguments that he cannot be extradited is a gentleman called Miguel Schweitzer, who will later become the Minister of Justice of General Pinochet. But Miguel Schweitzer has a son who is 18, and that man is also called Miguel Schweitzer, and he helps his father write the legal opinion that essentially will get Walther Rauff off the hook. 40 years later, when I'm in the Pinochet case in London in the House of Lords, I'm sitting in my seat, and the man next to me is Miguel Schweitzer, the son, who by now is Augusto Pinochet's principal lawyer in London. It's a very small and crazily connected world.
Todo el libro está lleno de estas coincidencias increíbles.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, we can come on to it, but it turns out that my wife's own family was very much involved in the case of Pinochet that I had no idea about.
También hablas de un plan muy elaborado de la inteligencia israelí para matar a Walther Rauff en Chile. ¿Cómo te enteraste de eso?
Yeah, that comes much later. That comes in 1979 when the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, resumes the hunt for Nazis. They send a former colleague of Rauff's, called Karl Wolff, who was his boss in Milan in Italy, where Rauff was the head of the Gestapo, to Santiago. They meet. Wolff is accompanied by a very famous West German journalist called Gerd Heidemann, who will become famous later as the man who's responsible for the forgeries of the Hitler diaries, a very notorious story in Britain in the 1980s. The two men spend 4 days with Rauff. They interview him. I've got the transcripts. Everything is recorded. And then when they return to Hamburg, Gerd Heidemann provides all the information about Rauff to the Secret Intelligence Service of Israel, the Mossad, and they send a hit squad to Santiago. We've got it in graphic detail. It's an unbelievable story. And Rauff is saved by his dog, Rex, who goes crazy as soon as anyone approaches the house.
And the Mossad, y el Mossad finalmente dijo que es demasiado complicado, podría ser desordenado hacer este plan de asesinato. The assassination plan.
They get very close. The squad comes to Santiago. The squad finds the house. The squad waits. The squad is within 1 minute of entering the house. So I think Rauff himself will never find out about this. And then the dog goes crazy. They retreat. They come back a few days later, and then they call. Same thing happens. Rauff's girlfriend, by then his wife has died. He has a girlfriend, Nena Zuniga, and she comes out of the house very aggressively, and they don't have orders to kill the girlfriend, so they retreat.
¿Y él nunca supo que estuvo tan cerca de ser asesinado?
I think he never knew. The grandson, from the grandson I got the impression they never knew that he came within a minute of being assassinated.
Okay.
He always worried about being assassinated.
Yeah. What happens? ¿Qué pasa después del golpe de 1973? ¿Cómo Walther Rauff entra en contacto con la DINA y con el sistema represivo del nuevo régimen en Chile?
So the precise mechanics of how it happens, we don't know. What I've got is some of his correspondence to his sister. He writes in code. He's very worried that he's going to be somehow targeted, so all of the letters are very carefully written. But he says, for example, to his sister, I'm now like a protected monument after the coup. He's very supportive of the coup. He tells his sister how wonderful it's been, what a good job the Pinochet regime is doing. But nothing about any relationship with the DINA, with Manuel Contreras, or with Pinochet himself. That comes from other sources. As you well know, it is said the documents do not exist in relation to the DINA's work. They were destroyed after 1977. So I had to talk to people, and eventually the connections came through a number of detainees, former prisoners, who told me they had been personally interrogated or questioned by Walther Rauff, but most significantly, 2 former DINA agents who I showed photographs to, a sort of beauty parade of photographs. They didn't recognize anyone. They recognized one man. They didn't know his name. It was Walther Rauff. And from that, I got the story, and in particular the connection with another pesquera in a different town called San Antonio, the pesquera Arauco.
¿Cuál fue el papel de Rauff y Pesquera Arauco en lo que sucedió después?
The Pinochet regime acquired the pesquera Arauco on the day of the coup. Workers there told me the military turned up, surrounded the pesquera Arauco, and basically stayed in charge of it for the next 18 months. Why were they interested in the pesquera Arauco? Because the pesquera Arauco had a number of things. They had 310 Chevrolet C10 and C30 refrigerated vans. And those vans, we now know, were used to transport detainees between places of detention. One of the people I met who told me he had been interrogated by Walther Rauff and tortured by Walther Rauff, Leon Gomez, who passed away a few weeks ago, also had told me he had been transported in a pesquera Arauco van. And so those vans were used to transport people and to disappear people. And of course, what I learned from the former DINA agents was that Rauff was associated with the operation of the pesquera Arauco and those vans. So the terrible truth is that a man who was involved with using vans to disappear people by gas in the 1940s in the 1970s appears to be involved in using vans to disappear people that are refrigerated vans.
Después de toda tu investigación, ¿crees que hay pruebas suficientes para decir con certeza que Walther Rauff trabajó para la DINA en Chile?
I'm absolutely certain, I have no doubt whatsoever, but I am not an expert in Chilean law, so I took the precaution of visiting a number of Chilean lawyers and judges and share with them everything that I had, the strong points, the weak points. And there was one person in particular, and he features in the book, a very distinguished Chilean judge, Mario Carosa, and he said at the end of our conversation, on the basis of what you've got, there is a presumption that he's involved. I've got no doubt that he was involved, there's no question.
¿Cuál es el papel de Colonia Dignidad en esta historia y en particular en relación a Rauff?
A lot of people say Walther Rauff was at Colonia Dignidad. I found no evidence that he was. And so I have an open mind about that. I suspect he did visit, but I have no proof for that. But what was very significant was that following, I went to Colonia Dignidad. It was frankly very shocking, and I'm even more shocked that it still functions today as a hotel and a restaurant. But after Colonia Dignidad, in a state of shock, I went to Concepcion and I met with a Chilean journalist and academic, Carlos Basso. He was interested about my visit to Colonia Dignidad. He said, you know, there's someone you need to meet. And this was a man called Samuel Fuenzalida, who had been at Londres 38 and who had accompanied a detainee from a place of detention in Santiago to execution in Colonia Dignidad. And that was the big break, because what happened was, on the telephone, speaking with Samuel Fuenzalida, we showed him 3 photographs. He didn't recognize 2 of the men, but the third man, whose name he did not know, he recognized. I said, how do you know this man? He said, because when I was at the DINA headquarters in Marcoleta, this man was there. He was associated with the pesquera. Which pesquera? Pesquera Arauco. In fact, I wanted to push Samuel Fuenzalida, and so I said, will you take me to the headquarters, the building in the Marcoleta? And we went straight away. He said, that's the building where it happened. And Samuel Fuenzalida then introduced me to another character who I think is rather well known in Chile, Jorgelino Vergara, El Mosito, who worked directly with Contreras, who cut a deal with Chilean prosecutors. He would say everything he saw until the age of 18, nothing after the age of 18, and essentially he is immune from investigation or prosecution. And he went with me to San Antonio, and we visited all of the places.
Después del golpe, ¿hubo alguna relación personal entre Walther Rauff y Pinochet o nunca más se volvieron a ver?
I don't know. I don't know. I would be surprised if they did not have any contact, but I have no evidence of contact. The only evidence I have contact with is between Rauff and Manuel Contreras on numerous occasions around San Antonio, at Contreras' house, at the meeting where Operation Condor was established, and at a small former hotel, rather wonderful place, called La Bahia Hotel in the wonderful town of Cartagena. That was where Rauff and Contreras would meet and talk about paquetes.
Let's talk about... Hablemos del juicio a Pinochet en Londres. ¿Cómo te involucraste en ese caso, in this trial?
I was in Paris at going to attend my grandfather's funeral when I received a phone call from my law office in London. And the law office said, we've had contact. This was the 30th of October 1998. I remember the day very well. We've had contact from Mr. Pinochet's lawyers. They would like to hire you to argue that he has complete immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts. I said, I'm at my grandfather's funeral. I'll call you back tomorrow, talk about it then. I arrive at the cemetery. I meet my wife, who's also a lawyer. I tell her, frankly, with some excitement, because I would have done it. We have a principle for the English barristers called the taxi driver principle, the cab rank principle. We can't say we don't like someone, we won't act for them, we don't like their politics, we don't like their gender, we don't like the colour of their skin. We have a responsibility, there are exceptions, to accept every case. So I would have done it. And frankly, I would have been excited to do it because it was the most important international criminal case since Nuremberg. My wife said, will you do it? I said, taxi driver principle. She said, taxi driver principle is bullshit, will you do it? I said, taxi driver principle. She said, okay, do it if you want. I'll divorce you tomorrow if you do it. I didn't do it. I managed to get out of it, And 3 days later, I was approached by the other side, by Human Rights Watch, and I acted for Human Rights Watch. So I was involved throughout the proceedings. I mean, I had a peripheral role. We were interveners in the case, and then for the Belgian government on the medical records.
Yeah. As we know, finally, como sabemos, finalmente la decisión del gobierno británico fue enviar a Pinochet de vuelta a Chile. Y tú tienes detalles muy interesantes en el libro sobre cómo se toma finalmente esa decisión. Hablaste con Cristian Tolosa, quien era un asesor relevante del presidente Frey. ¿Cuál fue el papel de Tolosa y qué descubriste al respecto? What do you discover about it?
So I'd come across the name Tolosa, but only 1 or 2 newspaper articles, 1 book of passing mention. I interviewed Mr. Insulza, who'd been the Foreign Secretary and then the Secretary General of the government of President Frey, and he mentioned that Tolosa was the man to speak to. Eventually, I found Christian Tolosa, a very decent, very honourable, intelligent and restrained man, and I met him on numerous occasions, and as you probably know with interviews it takes time to build up a relationship of trust, but eventually he told me, I think what we all knew, that there was a deal between the Chilean government and the British government. The deal was very simple. They would determine that General Pinochet was not fit for trial. He would return to Chile, and upon his return he would be stripped of his immunity, and it would be possible to investigate him, indict him, prosecute him, and try him. That was the deal. Now, there was one aspect of that deal which was confirmed to me by Christian Tolosa's counterpart, a very well-known civil servant in Britain called Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell had been Tony Blair's chief of staff for 10 years at 10 Downing Street. All the meetings between Tolosa and Powell were at 10 Downing Street. And Powell is also the architect of what's called the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. So he's a very significant, highly respected figure in British society. He confirmed everything that Christian Tolosa told me. But in particular, there was one significant issue. The British wanted proof, evidence, that the Chilean authorities had enough information, evidence of General Pinochet's role in acts of killing to allow his immunity to be removed. And that proof was taken by Christian Tolosa to London in the autumn, European autumn of 1999, in the form of a document which was signed by Augusto Pinochet, which concerned an operation known as the Caravan de la Muerte, the Caravan of Death, and it demonstrated that Augusto Pinochet had personally authorized and ordered that act of killing. The document was given to Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell told me the document exists somewhere in England. What is striking about that is that document has never been known about in Chile, has never been made public in Chile. Mario Carranza confirmed to me that document is unknown to Chilean judges, and that I think does raise a very significant issue for Chilean society, because we've always been told, Chileans have always been told, there are no documents. At least one document exists.
There is. And also, Tolosa talked to you about a report with instruction. También Tolosa habló contigo sobre un informe con instrucciones para Pinochet sobre cómo debía comportarse de una manera que diera a entender que no estaba en condiciones de ser juzgado. To behave in some way that will be understand that he's not fit to the trial. How's that story?
Sure. So from a person that I don't name in the book, I had learned about the existence of a dossier, and Christian Tolosa indeed spoke to me about that dossier, which was to assist, shall we say, General Pinochet to create the impression he was unfit for trial. Now, separately, I have corroboration on the side in England. One of the, actually probably my favourite character in the whole book, is a lady called Jean Pateras, who is both Chilean and British. And she was the interpreter for Scotland Yard. And she described to me many things. She was with General Pinochet from the moment of his arrest to the moment he was wheeled onto the plane at an airport in Lincolnshire and sent back to Chile. But in around September 1999, she told me several stories, but one as an example. She goes to visit General Pinochet at the house in Wentworth where he's being detained, and the general says to her, Jean, something amazing has happened. What's that, General? A lady came to see me yesterday and I didn't know who she was. And then they told me that it was my wife, Lucia. Jean just said, "Come on, stop being so ridiculous." And the two of them would have smiled and known that he was pretending.
Yeah.
And she observed numerous other things. She had no doubt that he was fit for trial. And she introduced me to the medical doctor for Scotland Yard, Peter Dean, who had looked after medically General Pinochet. They were very worried, Scotland Yard, that he might fall ill or even die, so they really wanted to look after him. Peter Dean was the medical doctor who looked after him. He said he was absolutely fine and fit for trial, no doubts, no questions. When he said that to Jack Straw, he wrote a letter to Jack Straw, the Home Secretary who took the decision to return Pinochet to Chile. Peter Dean was removed from the case.
Entonces, ¿crees que esto, fingir que estaba mentalmente enfermo, fue parte de un trato? ¿Las autoridades del Reino Unido y las autoridades chilenas sabían que era una farsa?
Everybody knew. The one person who told me he didn't know was Jack Straw, and I pushed him. I interviewed him on more than one occasion, and I pushed him. He said, "I didn't know about the deal. I leave it to readers to form a view as to the credibility of that claim. I suspect he may not have known the details, but I'd be very surprised if he didn't know something." But incidentally, Jack Straw did tell me, it's another revelation in the book, is that knowing now what he knows, he regrets the decision he's taken, and if he were to do it again, he would have sent Pinochet to Madrid.
Dos increíbles historias entrelazadas en esta investigación de Phillipe Sands. Phillipe, muchas gracias por habernos acompañado. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ustedes también por habernos acompañado en este capítulo de La Entrevista. Este es el libro Calle Londres 38, 2 casos de impunidad, Pinochet en Inglaterra y un nazi en la Patagonia. Nos vemos en otra edición de La Entrevista en Chilevisión.